One of America's most iconic cities, the beating heart of finance, innovation, and culture, just changed direction completely. Zohran Mamdani, a self-described democratic socialist, has been elected mayor of New York City. Some are calling it a revolution. Others are calling it an economic disaster waiting to happen. But beneath the headlines lies something much bigger, a shift that could rewrite how American cities function, how wealth moves, and even how power itself is distributed. So today, let's unpack what this really means, not just for New York, but for every one of us. There are moments in history where you can feel the ground shifting beneath your feet. Election night was one of those moments. The polls had closed across New York City, and despite all the early predictions suggesting this would be a close race that might favor the establishment candidate, something unexpected was unfolding. Voter turnout was remarkably high, not just high in the usual sense, but specifically among younger voters and progressive activists who'd been energized by a message that promised to turn the system upside down. Now, I want you to picture this scene for a moment. Throughout the day, there were reports of irregularities at polling stations. Some locations experienced what they call swatting. Those are false threats called in to create chaos and potentially discourage people from voting. Several sites in areas known for leaning more conservative received bomb threats via email. Law enforcement was investigating whether these incidents were designed to suppress certain voters. Meanwhile, thousands of New Yorkers were posting photos of their ballots online, pointing out something curious. Mamdani's name appeared twice on many ballots, while his opponent's name showed up only once, tucked away in the bottom right corner. Whether this was intentional design or bureaucratic oversight, it became a talking point that fed into a larger narrative about fairness and manipulation. But here's what really caught everyone's attention. The early voting numbers told a story that political analysts are still trying to fully understand. In the previous mayoral race, just a few years earlier, roughly 170,000 people had voted early. This time, over 700,000. That's more than 4 times the previous number. And when you looked at the demographics, something fascinating emerged. About 60% of these early voters were over 44 years old, not exactly. Mamdani's core base of enthusiastic young progressives. This suggested that perhaps the opposition was more motivated than anyone realized, coming out in force to try to prevent exactly what ended up happening. Yet despite this surge in older, presumably more moderate voters, Mamdani still won. Think about that for a second. It means his coalition of younger voters, combined with working-class New Yorkers frustrated with the status quo, managed to overcome what should have been a significant disadvantage. This wasn't just an election, it was a statement. A ripple in New York that could soon become a wave across America. So what drove this unexpected rise? To truly understand Mamdani's victory, you have to understand the anger beneath it. And I'm not talking about the kind of anger that flares up and fades away. This is the deep, simmering frustration that builds over years of watching the same promises made and broken, the same faces cycling through power, the same sense that the system works for everyone except you. Think back to how you felt during different moments of change in your own lifetime. Maybe you remember the 1970s, when New York City was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Garbage piled up in the streets, crime was rampant. The city that had once symbolized American possibility felt like it was falling apart. People were desperate for something, anything, to change. That desperation creates openings for outsiders who promise to tear down and rebuild. Or perhaps you remember 2016, when another outsider, Donald Trump, rode a wave of anti-establishment fury all the way to the White House. People across America, particularly in places that felt forgotten by coastal elites, decided they'd rather take a chance on chaos than continue with what they saw as a rigged game. Mamdani tapped into that exact same energy, just from the opposite direction. He positioned himself as the anti-Trump in an anti-Trump town. Where Trump attacked government regulations and championed business, Mamdani attacked corporate greed and championed government intervention. Where Trump spoke to rural and suburban frustration, Mamdani spoke to urban and working-class frustration. But the emotional core was identical, the sense that ordinary people have been left behind, while those at the top play by different rules. When you're a young person in New York City paying over half your income for a cramped apartment, working multiple jobs just to stay afloat, watching billionaires get richer while you struggle to save anything, well, someone promising to freeze your rent and tax the wealthy starts to sound pretty appealing, doesn't it? But here's the catch, and this is where we need to shift from emotion to mathematics. Winning on emotion is easy, governing on math is hard. And the math facing New York City right now? It's brutal. Let me walk you through some numbers, not to bore you, but because they tell a story that everyone needs to understand. New York City's budget depends heavily on a relatively small number of very high earners. We're talking about the top 1 or 2% of taxpayers contributing somewhere around 40 to 50% of the city's total tax revenue. Now, you might think, good, let them pay their share. And there's certainly an argument to be made about fairness and contribution. But here's the problem, and this is where ideology crashes into reality. Those high earners are mobile. They can leave. And increasingly, they are. Think of it like this. Imagine you're running a small town where most of your budget comes from 10 families. They pay for the schools, the roads, the police, the fire department. Now imagine you tell those 10 families that you're going to double their property taxes while also making their lives more difficult in various ways. More regulations, more restrictions. Maybe you freeze their ability to raise rents on properties they own. Perhaps you even talk about defunding the police that keep their neighborhoods safe. What do you think happens? Some of them start looking at the map and noticing there are other towns nearby with lower taxes, better services, and friendlier attitudes toward people with resources. This isn't theoretical. Economists across the political spectrum, liberal, conservative, and everything in between, have studied this pattern for decades. When you raise taxes beyond a certain threshold, especially in places where people have options to relocate, you trigger what they call tax flight. And here's the insidious part. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not like everyone packs up and leaves on the same day. Instead, it's gradual. A few families here, a few businesses there. A hedge fund moves its headquarters to Texas. A tech company decides to expand in Florida instead of Manhattan. A successful entrepreneur quietly changes his residency to Tennessee. Each individual departure might not seem like a big deal. But remember that math we talked about when the top % or 2 are funding roughly half your budget. Losing even a relatively small number of them creates a massive hole in your finances. And it's not just the direct tax revenue. These are the people who donate to charities, who spend money at restaurants and shops, who employ others. When they leave, they take entire ecosystems with them. One commentator described the impact of losing just one particularly wealthy individual. We're talking about someone who had been the single largest charitable donor in his city, contributing to everything from art museums to homeless shelters. When he relocated to another state because of tax policy, it created a gap in the city budget measured in the tens of millions of dollars. Suddenly, the charities that depended on his generosity had to cut programs. The cultural institutions had to scale back, and the government had to either raise taxes on everyone else to fill the gap or cut services. Either way, everyone ended up worse off. Now, I want to be clear about something, because this is where these discussions often go off the rails. This isn't about defending billionaires or saying wealthy people shouldn't pay taxes. That's not the point at all. The point is understanding cause and effect. Understanding that when you're making policy, you have to account for how people will actually respond, not how you wish they would respond. You can argue all day about what's fair and what people should do, but if your policies are based on what people should do rather than what they will do, you're setting yourself up for disaster. And, according to the data, that exodus has already begun. Before Mamdani even took office, surveys were showing that somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million New Yorkers, we're talking about roughly 1 in every 8 or 9 residents, were seriously considering leaving the city. Not just daydreaming about it, but actively making plans, looking at real estate in other states, calculating the cost savings, talking to their employers about remote work arrangements. Another survey found that about a quarter of New Yorkers would consider leaving depending on how things unfold over the next year or two. Now, will all of these people actually go? Probably not. There's always a gap between saying you'll do something and actually doing it. Moving is hard. Leaving behind friends, family, familiar places, that's a big decision. But even if only a fraction of these people follow through, we're talking about a significant population shift. And here's where it gets really interesting. These aren't random people leaving. The data shows that those most likely to relocate are exactly the ones the city can least afford to lose: educated professionals, successful business owners, people in their earning prime who've been paying the most in taxes. They're heading to very specific destinations. Florida, with its beaches and zero income tax. Texas, with its booming economy and low cost of living. Tennessee, where you can buy a house for a fraction of what a cramped apartment costs in Manhattan. When those moving vans roll out, they don't just take people, they take the city's lifeblood. Think about what happens next in this chain reaction. The tax base shrinks, so the city has less money. To make up the difference, they raise taxes on those who remain. But raising taxes makes more people want to leave, which shrinks the tax base further, which leads to more tax increases or service cuts, which makes even more people leave. It's a vicious cycle, a feedback loop, that's very hard to stop once it gets momentum. And we've seen this movie before. This isn't speculation or theory. This is history repeating itself. Let me take you back to the 1970s. New York City was the financial capital of the world, the cultural center of America, the city that never sleeps, and it nearly died. The city had been spending far beyond its means for years, expanding services and payrolls, making promises to unions and voters that sounded great but weren't sustainable. When the economy hit a rough patch, the whole house of cards came tumbling down. The city couldn't pay its bills. It was literally on the verge of bankruptcy. You know what President Ford said at the time? The newspapers summarized his position with a headline that became infamous: Ford to city, drop dead. The federal government refused to bail out New York, forcing the city to make painful cuts and reforms. Crime skyrocketed. Services deteriorated. The middle class fled to the suburbs. Times Square became a symbol of urban decay, not the shiny tourist destination you might know today, but a dangerous zone of adult theaters and street crime that respectable people avoided. It took decades to recover from that collapse. It required fundamental reforms, new leadership, a complete reimagining of how the city operated. People like Rudy Giuliani in the 90s implemented policies, some controversial, but effective, that reduced crime, improved quality of life, and convinced businesses and residents that New York could be great again. By the 2000s and 2010s, the city had been reborn. Property values soared. The wealthy returned. New businesses flourished. The tax revenue that came with prosperity allowed the city to provide services that people in most of America could only dream of. But here's the thing about prosperity: it's fragile. It depends on confidence, on people believing that if they invest in a place, work hard, build something, they'll be able to enjoy the fruits of that labor. When you start implementing policies that feel punitive towards success, that confidence erodes, and once it erodes, it's very hard to rebuild. This is what worries economists when they hear proposals like rent freezes. On the surface, freezing rent sounds compassionate, doesn't it? If you're a renter, and most New Yorkers are, the idea that your landlord can't raise your rent for 4 years sounds like a lifeline. Finally, some stability. Some protection against being priced out of your own neighborhood. I understand that appeal, I really do. But let's think through what happens next. If you're a landlord and maybe you're not some faceless corporation, maybe you're someone who bought a building as an investment for retirement, your costs don't freeze. Property taxes keep going up. Maintenance costs keep going up. Insurance keeps going up. Heating, water, repairs, all of it keeps getting more expensive. But your income from rent is frozen, so what do? Well, you have a few options, none of them good. You can defer maintenance, let things slide, don't fix what isn't immediately broken, hope nothing major goes wrong. You can try to find other ways to squeeze revenue, maybe charging fees for things that used to be included. Or you can just decide this investment isn't worth it anymore and sell to whoever is willing to take the risk, probably a large corporation that has the resources to wait out the freeze. Or maybe you just let the building deteriorate until it's not worth owning. Now multiply that decision by thousands of property owners across the city. What happens to the housing stock? It ages, it declines. Fewer new apartments get built because who wants to invest in a market where the government can arbitrarily freeze your revenue? The shortage of housing gets worse, not better. And here's the ultimate irony: when the rent freeze eventually ends, and it will end because nothing lasts forever, rents spike dramatically because there's even less supply, and landlords need to make up for years of losses. This pattern has played out in virtually every city that's tried aggressive rent control. Economists have studied it extensively. They've even compared it to trying to stop the ocean tide by building a wall. You might hold it back temporarily,